Ever feel like you're stuck under this massive shadow,
Yeah.
and your voice is just this tiny little thing? Like, it could never make a dent in a problem as big and as global as climate change.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that weight.
But then you hear about these young women around the world, and it's like they're shining these powerful lights, cutting right through that darkness. They're facing this crisis head on, and they're not backing down.
That's exactly the kind of energy we need right now, and that's actually what we're diving into today.
Oh, it's seriously inspiring.
Yeah.
We're talking about the book Climate Sisters, Resisting Ecocide, and let me tell you, it's a total game changer.
What I found really fascinating about this book was how it takes these huge global issues and brings them down to a personal level. It's not just about statistics and data, it's about real people, real stories.
Exactly. We're digging into excerpts from Climate Sisters by, and this is kind of cool, M. Scenery.
Lowercase m. I like it. It's got this understated vibe.
Right. So we've got excerpts from the preface, the introduction, even a climate glossary because, hey, knowledge is power. But the heart of this book, it's the stories of these incredible young women who are leading the charge against climate change.
Yeah, and I think what's important to note here is that the author doesn't just give us a surface level look at these activists. Her background is in women's activism and social justice, so she's coming at this from a place of deep understanding about the forces that shape these women's lives, their experiences, their struggles, and how all of that fuels their drive to create change.
And speaking of struggles, the book definitely doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of the climate crisis. I mean, we're talking about some pretty sobering stuff. Like, did you know that the Earth's already warmed by 1.3 degrees Celsius?
And that's just the beginning. The book highlights how 2023 was the hottest year on record for a significant portion of the planet, which is crazy to think about. And billions of people felt the impact of that heat.
Yeah, we all remember that record-breaking heat wave this past May. And according to the book, that's just a small taste of what's to come if we don't make some serious changes.
The UN Emissions Gap Report basically lays it all out there. We are not even close to where we need to be in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
It's like, all right, we get it. Things are bad. But here's the thing. In the face of all that, this global movement of young women is rising up. And they're not waiting around for permission or for someone else to fix it. They're grabbing the microphone and demanding action. And one of the first voices we hear from is Amelia Telford, all the way from Australia.
Amelia's story is so powerful because she's bridging this really important gap between mainstream environmentalism and indigenous knowledge. The book talks about her work with the Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network, which, by the way, is an incredible organization that's all about empowering the next generation of indigenous climate leaders.
That's amazing. And it's interesting because Amelia talks about this feeling of inevitability when it comes to her activism. Like, it's not just something she chose to do. It's woven into who she is,
Totally. And that deep connection to her identity is what gives her activism this incredible power. It's not about waiting for someone else to take the lead. It's about recognizing the urgency and saying, we're here, we're ready, and we're not waiting any longer.
And from Australia, we jump over to Sweden, to a name I'm sure you've heard before, Greta Thunberg. Now, this book goes beyond the whole skipping school for climate protest narrative that we all know. It really digs into the years of personal conviction that led up to that. Did you know that she went vegan at a young age?
I didn't. I love how this book gives us these little-known details that add so much depth to her story.
Yeah, and she also worked on this environmental film called For Nature, way before the whole Fridays for Future movement exploded.
And speaking of Fridays for Future, the book does a great job of unpacking that turning point, specifically her speech at COP25, where she basically called out world leaders for their inaction.
It was like she was saying out loud what so many people had been thinking but were too afraid to voice.
Right. It was a carefully crafted message, but it was also raw, it was honest, and it resonated on a global scale.
Millions of people marching in the streets demanding climate action. Talk about impact.
You can't deny the power of her message and the movement she sparked, even if you don't agree with all of her tactics.
And this global impact is something the book highlights really well, because it features activists from all over the world, people like Tsui. She's a Chinese-American writer who explores this fascinating but often overlooked relationship we have with water.
Which, let's face it, climate change is making a whole lot more complicated.
Exactly. Bonnie's work adds this whole other layer to the climate conversation because it reminds us that this isn't just about, saving the polar bears or switching to electric cars. It's about our cultures, our livelihoods. It's about our very survival.
And Bonnie connects with readers on a personal level by weaving in her own experiences as a swimmer and how that shaped her perspective on, well, on everything. Life, death, the fragility of the natural world.
It's about making it real, making it relatable. And speaking of real and relatable, the book takes us to Hong Kong with Tori Tsui, who brings a whole other level of intensity to the table because she's lived through the immediate devastation of climate change. We're talking typhoons, the kind that rip through your life and leave scars.
Yeah, that's a whole different level of being on the front lines of this crisis, and it shaped her activism in such a powerful way.
She's become a leading voice for what's called intersectional climate action.
So it's about connecting the dots between climate justice, racial justice, and social equity.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that climate change doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't impact everyone equally. And it's so important to remember that, that those connections are real. Climate change isn't some abstract thing happening to someone else somewhere else. It's impacting real people, real communities.
Absolutely. And those impacts, those stories, they need to be at the forefront of the conversation. It's not just about science and policy, it's about people's lives.
Exactly. And speaking of powerful stories, the book takes us to the Philippines with Marinel Sumook Ubaldo. Talk about resilience, right? She's a survivor of Super Typhoon Haiyan.
Haiyan, that was, back in 2013, one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded.
Yeah, it absolutely devastated parts of the Philippines.
The scale of the destruction was just unimaginable, just heartbreaking.
And the book doesn't shy away from that. It goes into some pretty harrowing detail about what it was like to live through that day, that storm. But it's what Marinel did afterward that's truly remarkable.
She turned her pain into purpose,
Yeah.
She didn't just rebuild her own life. She became this incredible force for change.
Organizing climate strikes in the Philippines, speaking at COP21, demanding justice for all the lives lost to climate disasters. And there's this one quote from her that just stuck with me. She says, "We're still shouting for justice for those we lost because of climate disasters."
It gives me chills every time I read it. And it's that unwavering spirit, that refusal to be silenced, that really connects all of these climate sisters.
They're fighting for something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. They're not just advocating for policy changes. They're demanding a fundamental shift in how we value human life, how we prioritize the planet. They're saying our future is not negotiable.
And they're so creative and courageous in the way they're doing it. I mean, we've got Amelia connecting with indigenous knowledge, Greta sparking this global youth movement.
And Tori challenging these deeply rooted systems of oppression.
It's like they're rewriting the rule book on what it means to be an activist.
And they're doing it on their own terms. They're not waiting for permission or relying on outdated institutions. They're building their own platforms, finding their own solutions, and demanding that the world pay attention.
It's like they're taking that whole, if you want something done right, saying to a whole new level.
And showing us what true leadership looks like, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that really struck me about Climate Sisters was how it highlighted the fact that this isn't just happening in a few places. It's a global movement. We've only talked about 5 activists, but they're all connected to this huge network of organizations and individuals working across borders.
Yeah, and the book emphasizes how interconnected these movements are. They're sharing strategies and amplifying each other's voices. It's a truly global chorus demanding change.
It's amazing, and it makes you realize that we can all be a part of this movement. It's so easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the climate crisis. Like, what can I possibly do that would even make a dent?
I've totally been there. It can feel paralyzing sometimes. But, these women, their stories, their courage, it's such a powerful reminder that individual action, when we multiply that across communities, across continents, it can create extraordinary change.
Totally. What if instead of getting bogged down in the doom and gloom, we focus on the power we each have to make a difference? Even small things, like reducing our own carbon footprints, contacting our elected officials, supporting organizations that are doing good work.
All of that adds up. And maybe even more importantly, it inspires others to take action too. It's about changing the narrative, shifting from apathy to action, from despair to hope.
And hope is a big part of this book, isn't it? Climate Sisters could have easily just focused on the negative, the problems, the devastation. But it doesn't.
It chooses to focus on the resilience of the human spirit, the power of collective action, and the very real possibility of a better future. It's a call to action disguised as a collection of stories.
It really is.
And it reminds us that while these activists are leading the way, The fight for climate justice needs all of us to find our own lane, to use our voices, and to contribute to a more just and sustainable world.
So well said. Climate Sisters, resisting ecocide. Everyone check it out. Learn from these incredible activists. And let's keep the conversation going because like we've seen today, the power to create change is in our hands.
I couldn't agree more.